It was a busy afternoon at Street Harmony Hospital, a sprawling facility known for its impeccable reputation and state-of-the-art services. The halls bustled with the usual chaos of nurses rushing to and fro, doctors in their crisp white coats attending to their patients, and families anxiously waiting for news about their loved ones. Amid this hum of activity, Nurse Linda Whittaker walked briskly down the corridor, her face set in an expression of no-nonsense professionalism. Linda had worked at Street Harmony for over a decade. She was known for her efficiency, her sharp tongue, and though unspoken, her biases. Beneath her polished demeanor lay a simmering prejudice she carried into her interactions, though she rarely let it show outright. To her, appearances mattered most, and she often judged people based on how they looked before she even spoke to them. The sound of raised voices echoed from the emergency intake area as Linda approached the nurse's station. Her sharp blue eyes darted to the commotion. A middle-aged black man, wearing a plain but neatly pressed jacket, stood at the desk. He looked tired, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, but his presence commanded attention nonetheless. His eyes, filled with both wariness and quiet dignity, fixed on the receptionist. "I've been waiting for over an hour," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I need to see a doctor." Linda immediately assessed the scene, her gaze narrowing. The man didn't look like the type of patient she typically prioritized. His clothes were clean but simple, and he didn't carry himself with the urgency she expected from someone in an emergency. Without waiting for an explanation, Linda stepped in. "Sir, this is a busy hospital," she said curtly, her tone dripping with impatience. "We treat patients based on the severity of their condition. If it's not an emergency, you'll just have to wait your turn." The man turned to her, his eyes meeting hers steadily. "Ma'am, I'm not asking for special treatment," he said, his voice steady and respectful. "I'm only asking for fair treatment." Linda's lips tightened. "Fair treatment?" she repeated, her tone almost mocking. "Well, as I said, you'll be seen when it's your turn." The man sighed and stepped back, his expression unreadable. He moved to sit in one of the waiting area chairs, his posture straight, his hands resting on his knees. Several other nurses and staff glanced at him curiously, sensing the tension but saying nothing. Linda returned to her paperwork, dismissing him from her thoughts. But as the minutes ticked by, Linda couldn't help but notice how other patients seemed to defer to the man. An elderly woman sitting nearby leaned over and whispered something to him, her face lighting up in gratitude as he nodded and spoke softly in return. A young father with a crying toddler offered a murmured thank you, as the man helped him pick up a dropped toy. There was something about this man's quiet presence that commanded respect, though Linda stubbornly refused to acknowledge it. The hours passed, and the man remained patient, though his breathing seemed to grow slightly labored. Still, he didn't complain. When his name was finally called, Linda sighed audibly and stood to escort him to one of the examination rooms. She didn't bother to hide her irritation as she motioned for him to follow. Inside the sterile room, Linda began her usual routine. "Name?" she asked curtly. "James," he replied simply. "Last name?" "Johnson." She typed the name into the computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Age? 58. She glanced up briefly, noting the lines on his face, the silver strands threading through his hair. There was something about him, something familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. "Reason for visit?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Chest pain," he said, his voice calm despite the gravity of his words. Linda paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. Chest pain. That was serious, potentially life-threatening. She should have prioritized him earlier. But instead of acknowledging her mistake, she snapped. "You should have mentioned that sooner." "I did," James said, his tone steady, but with a hint of wariness. "To the receptionist when I arrived." Linda frowned, unwilling to admit fault. She muttered something about needing the doctor and stepped out of the room, leaving James alone. As she walked back to the nurse's station, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. There was something about James Johnson that unsettled her, though she couldn't pinpoint what it was. When she returned to the room with Dr. Patel, the senior physician on duty, James was sitting quietly, his hands folded in his lap. Dr. Purtell greeted him warmly and began the examination, his tone professional yet compassionate. As he worked, he asked James a series of questions about his medical history. "Have you experienced chest pain before?" Dr. Purtell asked. "Not often," James replied, "but it's happened a few times in the past year. I thought it was just stress." "Are you currently on any medications?" James hesitated and said, "No." Dr. Patel nodded and continued his examination. Linda stood off to the side, her arms crossed, watching silently. She couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort as she observed the way Dr. Patel interacted with James, with respect, with care. It was a stark contrast to her own dismissive attitude. Then, as Dr. Patel examined James's ID, his eyes widened slightly. He glanced up at James, his expression one of sudden recognition. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his tone shifting to one of deference. "Or shall I say, General Johnson?" Linda froze, her mind racing. "General." Her gaze snapped to James, who met her wide-eyed stare with calm indifference. For the first time that day, she felt a flicker of doubt, followed swiftly by a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. Who was this man, really? And what had she just done? The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. Linda's heart pounded as the realization began to dawn on her, but the truth was still just out of reach, tantalizingly close yet maddeningly elusive. And then in that charged silence, James spoke, his voice steady and unyielding. Linda felt her throat go dry as James's words hung in the air. Dr. Purtell adjusted his glasses, clearly aware of the shift in the room's energy. Linda glanced between them, struggling to reconcile what she'd just heard. "General." "A U.S. Army general." Her mind raced, replaying every word she had spoken to him since their first interaction. The dismissive tone, the irritation. She felt a knot tighten in her chest. But James, or rather General Johnson, didn't seem angry. If anything, he appeared calm, almost too calm, and that unnerved her even more. Dr. Patel leaned forward slightly, breaking the heavy silence. "General Johnson, it's an honor to meet you. I had no idea you were here today." He shot a pointed look at Linda, as though silently questioning why she hadn't informed him sooner. Linda shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. James didn't look at her. His eyes remained on Dr. Patel, though his expression was unreadable. "I appreciate your care, Doctor," James said evenly, his tone measured. "But I think it's important we address what's really going on here." Dr. Patel frowned slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean, sir?" James took a deep breath, as though bracing himself. "I came here today not just because of the chest pain, but because I've noticed something troubling. Something that, unfortunately, I've seen before in places I've visited across the country." Linda's stomach churned. She didn't know where this was going, but she had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to end well for her. James continued, his voice steady but carrying a weight that filled the room. "I've served this country for over 30 years. I've led men and women from every background, every race, and every walk of life. And during that time, I've learned one thing for certain. Respect shouldn't depend on what someone looks like." Linda felt her cheeks flush with heat. She looked down at her hands, avoiding his gaze. "I've seen how quick judgments can lead to mistakes," James went on. "Mistakes that cost lives. And while this isn't a battlefield, the principle remains the same. Everyone who walks into this hospital deserves the same level of care and respect, regardless of their appearance." Dr. Patel nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right, General. I couldn't agree more." James' eyes flicked to Linda then, pinning her in place. For the first time, she saw a hint of emotion in his gaze, not anger, but disappointment. Somehow, that felt worse. Linda swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean any disrespect," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her. "I didn't know that I was a general." James finished for her. His tone wasn't harsh, but carried a sharp edge. "And if I wasn't? If I were just an ordinary man, would that make me any less deserving of your time or care?" Linda's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She felt exposed, as though every flaw in her character had been laid bare. The truth was, she couldn't answer his question without admitting something she wasn't ready to face. Dr. Patel cleared his throat, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "General Johnson, I assure you, we take these matters very seriously. If there's been any oversight—" "It's not about oversight, Doctor," James interrupted gently. "It's about accountability. I've lived long enough to know that change doesn't happen unless we're willing to confront the hard truths." Dr. Patel nodded again, his expression thoughtful. "You're absolutely right, and I can assure you we will address this." James gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I appreciate that." Then, turning back to Linda, he added, "It's not too late to do better. For everyone." The words hit Linda like a punch to the gut. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but deep down, she knew there was no excuse for how she had treated him. As the tension in the room began to ease, Dr. Patel finished his examination and ordered a series of tests to determine the cause of James' chest pain. Linda excused herself, eager to escape the heavy atmosphere. She returned to the nurse's station, her thoughts swirling. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and deeply ashamed. Over the next hour, she kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with her colleagues. But she couldn't escape the memory of James's words or the way he had looked at her. It was as though he could see straight through her, past the surface, and into the parts of herself she didn't want to acknowledge. Meanwhile, James underwent his tests, his calm demeanor never wavering. Staff members who recognized him from his years of service treated him with a mixture of awe and respect. Word spread quickly through the hospital that a U.S. Army general was in their midst, and even those who didn't know him personally felt a sense of pride in having him there. But James wasn't interested in the attention. As he sat in the waiting area between tests, he observed the staff and patients around him. He noticed the little things, the way some nurses seemed to spend more time with certain patients than others, the way small gestures of kindness could brighten someone's day. And he noticed Linda, who seemed to be avoiding him altogether. It wasn't the first time James had encountered prejudice, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But he also knew that change didn't come from anger or confrontation alone. It came from understanding, from creating opportunities for growth. And as much as he had been disappointed by Linda's initial treatment of him, he also saw a chance for something more, a chance to open her eyes, to make her see the world differently. The hours stretched on, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the hospital corridors, James received his test results. Dr. Patel delivered the news personally, explaining that the chest pain was likely the result of stress and fatigue rather than something more serious. It was a relief, but it also served as a reminder for James to take better care of himself. As he prepared to leave, James stopped by the nurse's station one last time. Linda was there, shuffling papers and avoiding his gaze. When she saw him approach, her heart skipped a beat. She braced herself for another lecture, but James' expression was kind. "Nurse Whittaker," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I hope today has been a learning experience for both of us." Linda looked up at him, her cheeks flushed. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, the words catching in her throat. "For how I treated you, it wasn't right." James studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted. But remember, actions speak louder than words." With that, he turned and walked away, his steps measured and deliberate. Linda watched him go, a mix of emotions swirling in her chest. She knew she couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, she could do better moving forward. As James exited the hospital, the cold night air greeted him. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. The road ahead was still long, but he knew that every step, no matter how small, brought him closer to the change he hoped to see in the world. The following day, Linda arrived at the hospital feeling a heaviness she couldn't shake. Her usual brisk walk to the nurse's station felt slower, weighed down by the events of the previous day. She had replayed every interaction with General Johnson in her mind, each memory more unsettling than the last. It wasn't just what he'd said to her, it was how he'd said it. Calm, deliberate, and honest, without a trace of malice. Somehow, that had stung more than anger ever could. As Linda settled into her shift, the atmosphere in the hospital felt different. Whispers about the general's visit still lingered among the staff. Some spoke of his calm authority, while others marveled at the sheer coincidence of having such a high-ranking figure in their care. But for Linda, every mention of his name was like a pinprick, a reminder of the judgmental behavior she tried so hard to justify to herself. Midway through her shift, Linda was called to assist in a bustling patient intake area. A young black mother had arrived with her son, who was wheezing heavily and struggling to catch his breath. The woman's eyes were wide with panic as she clutched the boy close to her chest. Linda rushed over, instinct kicking in. "What happened?" she asked, kneeling to the boy's level. "I don't know," the mother said, her voice shaking. "He was fine this morning, but now he can't breathe. Please help him." Linda nodded, quickly assessing the situation. She called for a wheelchair and helped the boy into it, her focus sharp as she guided them to an examination room. She worked efficiently, setting up the equipment needed to stabilize the boy while reassuring the mother that everything would be fine. For a moment, she felt like her old self again. A nurse who cared, who acted without bias or hesitation. As the boy's breathing steadied, Linda noticed the mother watching her closely. "Thank you," the woman said softly. "You don't know how much this means to me." Linda hesitated, her mind flashing back to the general's words. Actions speak louder than words. She managed a small smile. "I'm just doing my job," she said, but the words felt inadequate, almost hollow. Later that day, Linda found herself drawn to the hospital archives, a place she rarely visited. She told herself it was just curiosity, but deep down, she knew she was looking for something. Answers, clarity, maybe even redemption. She searched for records on James Johnson, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed his name into the system. What she found surprised her. His military record was impressive, to say the least. He had served in multiple combat zones, led troops through some of the most challenging operations, and received numerous commendations for bravery and leadership. But what stood out most to Linda was his work after leaving active duty. General Johnson had dedicated much of his time to advocating for veterans and underserved communities, using his influence to push for better health care and social services. He wasn't just a leader in the army, he was a leader in life. Linda leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. How had she missed it? How had she looked at a man like that, and seen only what her biases allowed her to see? The weight of her actions pressed down on her, and for the first time, she began to truly question herself. Meanwhile, James sat in his modest home on the outskirts of town, reflecting on his visit to the hospital. He wasn't one to dwell on the past, but something about Nurse Whittaker's behavior had stuck with him. It wasn't the first time he had faced such treatment, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But what concerned him most wasn't her attitude. It was the system that allowed it to persist. James picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. It belonged to an old friend, someone who had served with him years ago and now worked in hospital administration. "Martin," James said when the call connected, "I need your help with something." As James explained the situation, his friend listened intently, offering his thoughts and suggestions. By the time the call ended, James had a plan. A way to address the deeper issues he had witnessed at the hospital without turning it into a personal vendetta. It wasn't just about one nurse or one bad day. It was about changing the culture, ensuring that respect and fairness were more than just ideals, they were realities. Back at the hospital, Linda's internal struggle was beginning to show. Her colleagues noticed her uncharacteristic quietness, the way she seemed lost in thought even during routine tasks. Dr. Patel, who had always been perceptive, pulled her aside during a lull in their shift. "Is everything okay, Linda?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I've just been thinking a lot," she admitted. About how we treat people. About how I treat people. Dr. Patel studied her for a moment before nodding. Self-reflection is a good start, he said. But real change comes from action. His words echoed James's, and Linda felt another pang of guilt. She nodded mutely, unable to find the right response. The days passed, but the weight of what had happened didn't fade. Linda began to pay closer attention to her interactions with patients, catching herself when old habits threatened to resurface. She started to see her colleagues in a new light, noticing the subtle ways their biases influenced their actions. It was uncomfortable, even painful, but it was also necessary. Then, one afternoon, Linda was surprised to see James Johnson back at the hospital. This time, he wasn't there as a patient. He was there as an advocate, speaking to hospital administrators and staff about the importance of equitable care. Linda watched from a distance as he addressed a small group in the conference room, his voice calm but powerful. She wanted to approach him, to say something, but fear held her back. What could she possibly say that would make a difference? She had already failed him once. But as the session ended and the crowd dispersed, James caught her eye. He gave her a small nod, an unspoken invitation. Gathering her courage, Linda walked over to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "General Johnson," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to thank you. For coming back. For everything." James regarded her for a moment, then smiled. "Thank you for listening," he said simply. It wasn't forgiveness. It was an opportunity, and Linda vowed not to waste it. Linda felt a nervous energy ripple through her as she watched General Johnson walk away. The quiet strength he carried with him was undeniable, and it left a mark on everyone who crossed his path. His return to the hospital had sparked conversations among the staff, some productive, others defensive. People are being forced to confront their own actions, or inactions, and that kind of introspection was never easy. For Linda, it had become impossible to ignore. Over the next few days, the tension in the hospital was palpable. Staff meetings were suddenly more intense, with heated discussions about patient care and accountability. Linda noticed the way some of her colleagues bristled at the mention of change. Others, like Dr. Patel, welcomed it, albeit cautiously. One afternoon, as Linda was organizing patient charts, she overheard a conversation between two nurses at the station. "I get that everyone deserves respect, but it feels like we're being targeted," one of them said, her voice low but sharp. "Targeted?" the other nurse replied. "Come on, you saw how Linda treated that guy. She's lucky it didn't blow up worse." Linda's hands froze mid-motion. The conversation wasn't loud, but it was loud enough for her to hear. Her chest tightened, a mix of shame and defensiveness bubbling to the surface. She wanted to interrupt, to defend herself, but what could she say? They weren't wrong. Instead, she stayed silent and turned back to her work, her mind racing. She knew her colleagues were talking about her, and in a way, she was grateful. If her mistakes could spark change, then maybe they were worth something. But the weight of being the example, of being the one who had to face the consequences, was almost unbearable. That evening, Linda stayed late at the hospital. The corridors were quieter, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by a peaceful stillness. She found herself walking aimlessly, her thoughts swirling like a storm. She ended up outside the conference room, where General Johnson had spoken just days earlier. The room was empty now, the chairs neatly arranged, but the energy lingered. She stepped inside and sat down in one of the chairs, letting the silence envelop her. For the first time in what felt like weeks, she allowed herself to truly reflect. She thought about James's words, about the young mother and her son, about the moments she had overlooked, dismissed, or justified. Each memory felt like a pebble dropping into a still pond, creating ripples that couldn't be undone. Linda's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She turned to see Dr. Patel standing in the doorway, a curious expression on his face. "Burning the midnight oil?" he asked, stepping inside. "Something like that," Linda replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Patel sat down in the chair next to her, his usual air of authority softened by the late hour. You've been carrying a lot lately, he said, his tone gentle. Linda nodded, unsure of how to respond. You know, Dr. Puttle continued, change isn't supposed to be comfortable. If it were, it wouldn't mean anything. I don't know if I can fix this, Linda admitted, her voice breaking slightly. Every time I think about what happened, I feel like I've already failed. Dr. Patel studied her for a moment before replying. Failure isn't final, Linda. What matters is what you do next. His words hung in the air, and Linda felt a glimmer of hope, fragile but real. The next day, Linda found herself thrust into another challenging situation. A middle-aged man arrived in the ER, clearly in distress but hesitant to speak. He was black, with deep lines etched into his face, and his clothes were worn and frayed. As Linda approached him, she noticed the way he avoided eye contact, his body language tense and guarded. Hi, I'm Linda, she said, her voice calm and steady. Can you tell me what's going on? The man hesitated, his gaze flicking to the floor. I don't want to be a bother, he mumbled. You're not a bother, Linda assured him. You're here because you need help, and that's what we're here for. It took time, but eventually the man opened up. He explained that he'd been experiencing chest pain for days, but had avoided coming to the hospital because he didn't think anyone would take him seriously. Linda felt a pang of guilt at his words, knowing all too well how valid his concerns were. She worked with care and patience, ensuring he felt heard and respected throughout the process. By the time his tests were completed, his demeanor had softened, and he even managed a small smile. Thank you, he said as she prepared his discharge paperwork. I wasn't sure what to expect, but you've been kind. Linda felt a lump rise in her throat. It's my job, she said softly, and I'm glad you came in. As the man left, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that she had just experienced a turning point. It wasn't dramatic or life-altering, but it was a step, a small, meaningful step toward being the nurse she wanted to be. But just as Linda began to feel a sense of progress, the hospital faced a new challenge. A formal complaint had been filed against the institution, citing concerns about racial bias in patient care. The details were vague, but the implications were clear. The hospital's reputation was on the line, and so was Linda's role in the unfolding drama. Staff meetings grew more tense, and rumors swirled about who had filed the complaint. Some suspected a disgruntled patient, while others whispered that General Johnson himself might have been involved. Linda couldn't help but wonder if her actions had been the catalyst, and the thought made her stomach churn. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Linda found herself at the center of an unspoken storm, her every move scrutinized by colleagues and supervisors alike. She knew the worst was yet to come, but she also knew she couldn't back down. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. The air in the hospital grew heavier with every passing day. The complaint had become the talk of the staff, each rumor more speculative than the last. Linda tried to stay focused on her work, but the weight of uncertainty was impossible to ignore. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the hospital. It was about her. Her actions, her choices, her failure to treat General Johnson with the respect he deserved. She kept replaying the moments in her mind, wondering if she was the reason the complaint existed at all. One evening, as Linda was finishing her shift, she noticed a figure waiting in the reception area. It was James Johnson. He wasn't in uniform this time, but his presence was just as commanding. He was speaking with one of the receptionists, his voice calm but firm, and Linda's heart began to race. She debated whether to approach him or keep her distance. Before she could decide, James looked up and met her gaze. Ms. Whittaker, he said, his tone neutral. Do you have a moment? Linda's stomach flipped, but she nodded. Of course. They moved to a quieter area near the cafeteria, where James gestured for her to sit. Linda felt her pulse quicken as she sat across from him, unsure of what was coming next. I wanted to speak with you about the complaint, James began, his voice steady. I thought it was important for you to hear directly from me. Linda's breath caught. You filed it, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, his expression unreadable. I did. This isn't about you personally, Linda. It's about something bigger. Linda's heart sank. She had suspected it. The following morning, confirmed the hospital was buzzing with anticipation. Prepared for. Word had spread that the board's investigation was nearing its conclusion. I know I was wrong, and everyone seemed trying to make things right. But Linda moved through her shift in haze, trying to focus on her patients while her mind raced with questions. The woman she had seen in the parking lot lingered in her thoughts. Who was she, and what role did she play in all of this? By mid-afternoon, Linda was called to a meeting in the main conference room. When she arrived, she found a mix of familiar faces, her colleagues, supervisors, and a few members of the hospital board. James Johnson was there too, seated near the front. His presence sent a ripple of tension through the room. Linda felt her stomach churn as she took her seat. The woman from the parking lot stood at the head of the table, her expression calm but commanding. She introduced herself as Miss Harper, a senior investigator for the board. Her voice was steady as she addressed the room, outlining the findings of their review. We've identified several areas where the hospital has fallen short in providing equitable care, Miss Harper began. These issues are systemic, and they required immediate action. Linda's heart sank. She had known the hospital wasn't perfect, but hearing it laid out so plainly was sobering. Miss Harper continued, detailing plans for new training programs, updated policies, and increased accountability measures. The changes were ambitious, but they were necessary. As Miss Harper spoke, Linda noticed James watching her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. A quiet determination that seemed to mirror her own. When Miss Harper finished, she invited James to say a few words. James rose from his seat, his presence commanding the room. He spoke about his experience as a patient, about the biases he had faced not just in hospital, but throughout his life. His words were powerful, and they left no room for excuses. But as he spoke, he also extended an olive branch. This isn't about tearing anyone down, he said. It's about building something better. Together. The room was silent as James returned to his seat. Linda felt a surge of emotion, pride, guilt, hope, all blending into a confusing swirl. She wanted to believe that change was possible, but she wasn't sure if she had earned the right to be part of it. As the meeting concluded, Miss Harper made an unexpected announcement. There's one more matter to address, she said, her gaze sweeping the room. The complaint was filed not just as a call for change, but as a test of accountability. General Johnson requested that we evaluate not only the hospital's practices, but also the individuals involved. Linda's breath caught. She felt every eye in the room turn toward her, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. Miss Harper continued, her tone measured. We reviewed the events in question, including the interaction between Ms. Whittaker and General Johnson. While Ms. Whittaker's actions were deeply concerning, her response since then has demonstrated genuine commitment to growth. Linda's cheeks flushed, a mix of relief and anxiety coursing through her. Miss Harper turned to her, her expression softening slightly. Linda, you made a serious mistake, but you've also taken steps to make amends. General Johnson himself has spoken to your efforts, and it's clear that you're willing to do the hard work of change. That's why we're giving you the opportunity to be part of the solution. Linda's heart raced. She hadn't expected this. A chance to redeem herself, to turn her mistakes into something meaningful. She looked at James, who gave her a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something close. As the meeting ended and people began to file out, Linda approached James. She felt a lump in her throat as she spoke. Thank you, she said quietly, for giving me another chance. James studied her for a moment before replying. Don't thank me yet. The real work is just beginning. His words stayed with her as she left the conference room. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for the hospital, for the patients they served, and for the possibility of real, lasting change. But as Linda walked through the quiet hallways, she couldn't shake a nagging feeling. Something about the way Miss Harper had framed her announcement didn't sit right. She replayed the words in her mind, trying to piece together what she might have missed. It wasn't until she reached her locker that it hit her. The complaint wasn't just about accountability, it was about trust. And while James had extended a hand to her, the trust she had broken with him, and countless others would take far longer to rebuild. Linda knew her journey was far from over. The changes ahead would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. And just as she resolved to face them head-on, a quiet but persistent thought took root in her mind. Asterisk, asterisk, what if a real challenge was yet to come, asterisk, asterisk.